Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and today our guest is Professor Gustav Ranis. He is the Frank Altschul Professor Emeritus of International Economics at Yale and was the director of the Macmillan Center from 1996 to 2004. Professor Ranis has more than 20 books and 300 articles on theoretical and policy-related issues of economic and human development to his credit. He served as Assistant Administrator for Policy and Planning in AID, Department of State, during the Johnson administration. He is here with us today to talk about his research on the priority of human development. Welcome, Professor Ranis.
Nice to be here.
In your research, you look at the link between human development and economic growth. Why is it important to look at that?
Well, most of the past history has been focused on economic growth. But the basic idea here is that growth is really a means to an end, not an end in itself. People don't eat GNP. They like long, happy, healthy lives. And human development measures that dimension of human welfare. So the idea is to look at the links between growth, which is still necessary, as a means to the end of increasing human development performance.
Okay, and what are the major links between human development and economic growth?
Well, there are two channels. One goes from economic growth to human development, and there's a feedback from human development back to economic growth. So if you measure human development as it is done by the Human Development Reports of the United Nations, it's measured in terms of things like infant mortality, literacy, levels of education, the things that people really care about in terms of their long and happy and healthy life. So you're starting with, let's say, a growth rate of a certain percentage. How is that money spent? Much of it is spent on luxury goods or consumer goods, and some of it is spent on things that produce increases in human development. Who are the agents that are doing this? They're the families, there's the government, and there's sort of NGOs, third sectors. Clearly, you will understand that families, especially if females are in charge of the allocation rather than males, like to spend money for their kids' education, for the health of their babies in particular, infant mortality, and literacy. And so how much of their income they spend on these things is very important from the point of view of that first channel. Since health and education are public goods as well as private goods, the government is very much involved, both the central government and, if it's a decentralized government, local governments, to one extent or another, spend quite a bit of their money on things which produce increases in human development, any one of those that I've mentioned. And then finally, the NGOs which spend most of their energy and most of their money on human development. So that's the one link from growth to human development. Then there's a reverse link when you have people with better levels of human development, they are more capable of producing growth in the next period. For example, if you have people who are healthier, they are producing, their labor is more effective or more efficient. Entrepreneurs are more active, managers are better equipped, and combined with investment rates, capital accumulation and capital that may come from inside and savings of the society itself, together will produce more GNP in the next period. So the cycle continues. And so you have countries which are doing fairly well, both with respect to growth and doing well with respect to enhancing the human development levels.
Okay. And you've looked at developing countries and categorized them in specific ways depending on these linkages. Can you speak to that a little bit and describe them?
Yeah. There are four categories. Some countries can be classified as being in a virtuous cycle. The virtuous cycle means that compared to all the developing countries, we're dealing mostly with developing countries, not with the mature countries or rich countries, compared to all the other developing countries, if they're doing better than average on growth and better than average on human development, call them being in a virtuous cycle. And if they're doing worse than the average on both, we call them a vicious cycle. And you can probably imagine that the virtuous cycle countries are largely in the virtuous ones are in East Asia, and the vicious ones are largely in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the interesting cases are the ones which do better than average on one, but worse than average on the other. And these are kind of lopsided cases. There are countries which do better than average on growth and worse than average on human development, and vice versa. And those are the two kind of lopsided categories which are quite interesting, and we do quite a bit of analysis on that. Because we find one of the interesting findings is that if a country is better than average on growth but worse than average on human development, it's very hard for them to graduate into the virtuous cycle, which everybody would like to be, and that's the promised land. While the other way around, if you're worse than average on growth but better than average on human development, you can graduate into the promised land of the virtuous cycle.
Okay, let's talk about some specific countries. Has anyone reached the promised land, and then conversely, is anyone stuck at the bottom, so to speak?
Yes, quite a few are at the bottom. Most of sub-Saharan Africa is vicious cycle all the way through. What we do is we divide the whole period from 1960 to 2004, I think it was, into decades and see how they progress over time. And we find that some countries get stuck, vicious cycle. Some are virtuous all the way through. But the interesting cases are the ones that move and graduate or fail to graduate.
Any particular countries that you
Well,
can
like
cite?
China, for example. China was for a while human development lopsided in favor of human development, and they ultimately graduated into virtuous cycle. On the other hand, Egypt was lopsided in favor of growth and ended up in a vicious cycle for the time being. I mean, there's always a chance for it to recover. But it seems to be true that in order to recover, you have to move towards the human development lopsidedness before you can get into the promised land. That seems, there's been no country we found which is lopsided in favor of growth and makes it into the promised land.
And what are we looking at in terms of time periods for a country to, move in one direction or another? I imagine it varies, but is there any kind of average?
Well, some of them it takes a decade, 2 decades. We've done this 5 decades and look at decade by decade, see what's happening. So we not only see the whole period, but also the decade by decade. And some countries can shift from decade to another. Sometimes they fall back. They have a crisis of one kind or another, through external shocks, one kind or another. And so you can't make it generalize about how long it will take, but you can be sure about what I said before, which is that you've got to move to favor human development if ultimately you're going to reach the virtuous cycle.
Okay, so in looking at your research, that would be one of the conclusions. Are there any others that you've reached through your work?
Well, one of the main conclusions is that the old idea, which in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, people said, let's grow first and worry about things like what they used to call social elements later. Now, this research shows that that social sort of soft stuff is really quite essential. It's not soft, it's really hard, and it needs to be taken into account early on. So you either have to move together in both directions, or if you have a choice to make, human development should come first if you're going to try to make it. So that's the most important conclusion. There are other conclusions, such as when it comes to how the money gets spent. For example, take the families. As I mentioned earlier, we find that, and this is other research that's been done by lots of other people, that to the extent that the decision maker is the father, the family is much more likely to spend things on not human development oriented goods, while if it's a female-headed family, or at least the woman contributes to the family income and has a voice in how money is spent, you're more likely to get money spent on human development objectives. Another conclusion, which is partly our work and partly comes from other work that we've looked at, if you have a decentralized government rather than a centralized government, there's likely to be more money spent on human development, because they're closer to what people really need and want, which often is human development. That's what people down at the grassroots are interested in.
Okay, and finally, it seems to me, policy implications that one could look towards based on your research and its conclusions. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, I've already done a bit of that, in the sense that the importance of literacy, infant mortality, and life expectancy as an objective of policy early on comes out clearly from the research we've done. And there's a huge activity now on this Human Development Index, which is a summary of the various things I've talked about, which is not only on a global level categorizing countries, how well they have done on human development, but also within countries. You get state-by-state comparisons. It's like league tables where people compete with each other to see how they're doing, and that's been a very healthy result of the whole effort. The idea started in the 80s, but since 1990, when the first Human Development Report was issued by the United Nations, this idea has kind of taken the attention of policymakers, both donors and, more interestingly, recipients, because recipients find this appealing in terms of what people really want. And to think of human development as the final objective, you can go beyond the 3 or 4 items I've mentioned. People like Amartya Sen at Harvard goes into capabilities, which is a broadened version of human development. What makes people happy? It's not just the things I've mentioned. There are other things like being left alone, having freedom of choice, having freedom of religion, all kinds of other issues which are called capabilities. But some of them are measurable and some are less measurable. But the whole approach to recognizing that GDP or GNP is only a means to a happy, long, and productive life is a big breakthrough, and has affected policymakers both in the recipient countries and in the donor community, foreign aid community.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for being with us, here with us today and sharing your research.
It's my pleasure.
For more information about Professor Rannes and his work, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.